Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. 100 years ago, Russia was consumed by revolution and unprecedented violence. It is not an understatement to say the Russian Revolution, or Bolshevik coup d'etat, was a defining moment of the 20th century. How did it change Russia and the world? Cross-talking the Russian Revolution, I'm joined by my guest here in Moscow, Jeffrey Roberts. He's a professor of history at University College Cork and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. We also have Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. And of course, we have Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with Sputnik International. All right, gentlemen, as always, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Jeffrey Roberts, let me go to you first here. 100 years on, I will ask the most obvious question. Was it worth it?
Was it worth it? Yes, I think it was.
Why?
Because what the revolution showed was that it was possible to change the world. I mean, what happened in 1917 was that the people intervened in history, fundamentally changed the course of world history.
But there are those that say that it was a coup d'etat, that the Bolsheviks didn't represent the people, that represented a very severe ideology and absurd power.
What happened in Russia was a popular revolution. The Bolsheviks came to power on a wave of revolution that swept through Russia. They weren't
on a revolutionary mood or a Bolshevik revolutionary mood?
Well, a revolutionary move. The Bolsheviks weren't a majority when they seized power, but they were a very strong minority, and they actually had a majority or a near majority in the urban areas. So the point is, you know, it wasn't just a Bolshevik coup d'état or insurrection that happened in Russia. There was a revolutionary upsurge, and the Bolsheviks were the beneficiary of it. And the point of this revolutionary upsurge was to, you know, not to just bring to power, you know, a particular group of people. It was all about, you know, reimagining the future, trying to, you know, find a completely different way of social.
But the people paid a very high price for that view of the world. Mark, I can see your position quite clear here. Go ahead.
No.
Same question.
Very nuanced. I do not consider myself a communist, maybe a post-Leninist. My wife is a communist.
Post-Leninist.
And a post-Leninist, yeah. Not a post-Marxist, a post-Leninist. I want to speak perhaps as IR theorist on the international relations level, what the Soviet Union meant to the world. It meant the end of Western colonialism and imperialism. Without the Soviet Union, the ability of the Third World to achieve independence, certainly within the time frame it did, it simply wouldn't have happened.
But Mark, you can make the same argument that the end of the First World War saw the end of the Western empires. The Russian Empire...
It didn't see the end of
it set the seeds of it, eventually did decades later. We just had the collapse of the Russian Empire. One cannot say that that was necessarily part of the same process.
Up until the 1980s, Nelson Mandela, who was supported by the Soviet Union and himself was a communist of sorts, was still opposed by Western governments, the United States, the United Kingdom, up until he succeeded, and then suddenly he's become, you know, the hero rather than the end. But
that's the whole point. Dima, that's the whole point. It's not just about the Soviet Union, it's about ideology. Absolutely. And that is the biggest outcome of that political transformation. You can use revolution, you can use coup d'etat, whatever you choose, but the fact of the matter is the rest of the century, or almost the rest of the century, was defined by the ideology that eventually took power in Russia.
Well, there is absolutely no doubt that the Russian Revolution played a role in the major role in the 20th century history, and most of that influence was positive. Maybe not on Russia itself, but on the world in general, definitely positive. But what I think is important, and what I think is not discussed in Russia and in the West, we see certain traits of this revolution, the worst ones, revealing themselves very clearly in the West right now. Look, destruction of monuments. Monopolization of science and the media.
Controlling speech.
Controlling speech. The mania of finding spies, not only foreign spies, but people who don't fit a certain ideology at home. So these are scary things. If you ask me about the most negative aspects of the Russian Revolution, I can refer you to the modern West, to the United States and the EU, and you will see a lot of them.
Okay.
But talking about the revolution as a whole, you know, I think we can agree on something. I will suggest you an image. You know, the Russian Revolution was like an elephant in the dark room that three philosophers, three wise men, tried to touch, you know, being blind.
To describe.
Yeah, one of them touched the leg and said, oh, the elephant is like a column. The other one touched the trunk and said, it is more flexible. The third one touched the tail and said, it's like a rope. So if you ask me about the Russian Revolution, was it a tragedy for Russia with millions of people dead, and a dramatic fall in living standards for the majority, a huge majority of the population? I will say yes.
And the living standards were pretty low at the time.
Absolutely. Then will you ask me, was it a popular uprising with people basically supporting the Bolsheviks during the civil war, opting for their own government and not an opposition liaised with the West? Yes. Was it an event that positively influenced the Western countries, that kind of encouraged them to introduce the social safety networks? Yes.
Workers' rights.
Women's rights, okay, literacy.
It's like an elephant where you have positive things and negative ones, but the negative ones are now evident in the
Jeffrey,
West.
you know, is there, you know, I was trained as a historian. One always has to stay away from the sense of historical inevitability. But why did the Bolsheviks win? I mean, there were more than one revolution that year, okay? There were different trends that were overlapping simultaneously. Why did they win? Was it just violence?
No, the Bolsheviks won, well, three reasons. Firstly, they had popular support, yeah? Secondly, because of Lenin's leadership. And thirdly, because the revolutionary events took place in the context of the First World War. And think about the Bolsheviks in 1917. They were the anti-war party. They were the peace party. That was enormously important to their, to their popularity. The other thing you have to remember about the Bolsheviks, of course, is that when they seize power in Russia, they don't see themselves as just being involved in a Russian revolution. They see their action as part of a broader world revolution. They see the Russian Revolution leading to a global revolution. So from the Bolshevik point of view, you know, the whole future of humanity was at stake in their actions in Russia.
So, Mark, what went wrong? Because you're all saying this was very idealistic, it was very painful, it was very, very costly, but we ended up with something like Stalinism.
Can I just interject that? What went wrong was the Civil War and the foreign intervention that followed. Yeah? That's what went wrong. That's when, that's the context in which the revolution begins to degenerate, in which Bolshevism, which was a kind of popular revolutionary movement, begins to take on these kind of bureaucratic, authoritarian, repressive features which become embedded in the Soviet Union. So it's the Civil War.
And then it became embedded in the system
itself. It's the Civil War. It's a very important role that's played by foreign intervention, by Western capitalist states trying to strangle Bolshevism.
Yeah, I want to add to the causes of the Bolshevik success just a little bit. I agree completely with what Jeffrey said, especially the anti-war party aspect of Bolsheviks. When the Kerensky and the Provisional Government seized power after the February Revolution that preceded the Bolshevik Revolution, they wanted to continue the war. This war that many Russians, Russia had already suffered some 6 million casualties at that point. The country was suffering from famine. They were exhausted. They couldn't understand why they were fighting what they saw as an imperialist war between imperialist European powers. They wanted out. Another thing, the Bolsheviks were incredibly disciplined as a party. They understood power. They knew how to take control of railroad stations, telegraph stations. They understood the nodes of power and communication that make society work and how to take
and their foes, they were opposed to each other as well. I mean, they had a sense of unity.
The third thing I would say is they had the support of the military, and this was crucial, particularly the Navy. Defections from the military at this point were 34,000 a month. And they were flocking to the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks were promising the end of the war. And they supported the Bolsheviks all through the February Revolution up until the culmination with the October Revolution. And without that crucial military support, I'm not talking officers, I'm talking the rank and file soldiers, particularly in the Navy, the Kronstadt sailors, the Aurora, and so on. They were crucial to being able to take power on the streets and hold government buildings.
Okay, Dima, Is the ideology, is violence embedded in the ideology, or is that just the political tool to make, to maintain power? Because I think there are conflicting trends here. This is an idealistic movement. A lot of things that that we'd heard in the 19th century in the socialist labor movement here. But once it comes to pass, once you come to power, you don't want to let it go, and you have to, for the good of the people, or the good of the party, or the good of the ideology. And I think that's also, I agree with the Civil War. But once they had a foothold, they would do anything it took to keep it.
Well, I would say that violence is akin to all radical ideologies, including neoliberalism or now
capitalism.
Agreed.
And the mechanism of repression is very simple with radical ideologies. We are right on the footstep towards happiness for the whole world. And who is preventing us from having it? Just 2 million people in Donbass? Smash them, These Alawites in Syria who stick to Assad, kill them. This is the attitude of the West, and that was the attitude of the Bolsheviks, but not from the very beginning. I think it's a very important question why the Bolsheviks came to power. 2 reasons. First, the February Revolution. Now in Russia, we don't separate these 2 things. We're talking about one revolution, not about February and October. And
we're going to talk about that.
I think it's right, because without February, there would be no October. What happened in February was that a bunch of liberal revolutionaries came to power and revealed themselves absolutely unfit to govern. We have very similar people now opposing Putin. They were very good at propaganda, Western-supported propaganda against the Tsar.
But hapless.
Yeah, 90% of the Russian population in February 1917 were convinced that Rasputin slept with the Empress, that he was a German agent, that she was a traitor. All of this nonsense,
Was that fake news?
The fake news of the revolution. A good point, Mark.
And fake news was much more important, because if you talk about the economic situation in February 1917 was not dramatic.
Let me jump in
People
here.
were eating a lot better than during the Civil War.
After our break, we'll continue our discussion on the Russian Revolution. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Russian Revolution 100 years on. Okay, Damon, go ahead and finish up your point.
So the first reason why Bolsheviks came to power was the inability of liberals to govern after February 1917. And the second reason was that when the Civil War really broke out, most of the Tsarist generals, Russian patriots, they took the side of the Reds. This is something that is not often mentioned.
But that was for the protection of the state, the people, because it certainly couldn't have been ideology.
I think I can give you a very good personal example. Alexei Brusilov, the famous general who defeated the Austrians in the First World War, when the army officers asked him, Alexei Ivanovich, what shall we do? There is a civil war going on. He said, governments come and go, Russia stays. Serve the government that we have, the Reds. Because they otherwise are liaised with our enemies from abroad. They are not able to govern. They want to return to the past.
What was his fate, ultimately?
Well,
Dima?
he died his own nature of death in the 20s, in 1926, having written a book which was written by a patriot and a monarchist, but in which he praised Trotsky.
Okay, well, I don't want to go into Trotsky. Okay, Jeffrey, I want to ask you something here, because I think this is something what our viewers here is. I live here. And this is the 100th anniversary. Not much excitement. I don't hear a lot of conversation. Certainly academics and pundits and commentators. But on the whole, it's not a big deal. There's a lot of ambivalence.
I think there's probably more discussion going on in Russia about the revolution than you might imagine. Russian public opinion is divided about the revolution, isn't it? There's some people who, half the population thinks it was, on the whole, not a bad thing.
56%.
Yeah, okay. And the other half, or whatever it's 44%, are very hostile.
I don't even know where to go. Yeah. I mean, haven't described the elephant. I don't know.
Yeah, but as a Russian, how do you feel about it? Because
absolutely,
having studied it, I have to say I have extreme ambivalence to it. And I think that's the word.
Well, the problem is that this anniversary, it unleashed a lot of more passions in the West than in Russia.
That's what I noticed.
In the West,
that's what I noticed.
The passions are completely misguided.
As
The
usual.
Economist compared Putin to the Tsar and said that he doesn't want to celebrate the centenary because he is afraid of sharing the fate of Nicholas II. This is stupid.
Mark
this
already mentioned
baloney,
it. Fake news, more fake news.
But the reality is that right now the West reminds me of the times of the Third International. The idea that we can't have liberal capitalism only in the United States and the EU, we have to spread it all over the world or we will be smashed. That's a completely Bolshevist idea, right? The destruction of monuments, like looking at history from today's viewpoint and saying that this guy was a slave owner, that guy was a racist. It's the same thing the Bolsheviks
one thing
did
I
with
can
the
tell you
19th
guys
century
is
generals.
that you go into any city and town in this country and you're still probably going to find a statue of Lenin. There's still a lot out there. You know, Mark,
that's nice.
What
history stays.
we already heard that it was the Civil War. Was embedded in the ideology of a totalitarian strain that culminated in Stalin? Because the great argument is, we've already heard about Trotsky, Bukharin, and there could have been different variants, different paths. I'm not convinced of that. I think it's a very totalitarian ideology.
I'm not a big fan of the word totalitarian. I think that itself is an ideology that was created in the West in the wake of World War II to try to equate fascism and communism, which I believe is a false equation.
I think it's erroneous.
Yes,
I think we have to remember that the Soviet Union was born not only in internal struggle, but it was from the moment of its creation, it was attacked from the capitalist world, under siege. It wasn't. This is left out of a lot of Western history books. That in 1918, the Western powers and Japan, most European countries, the United States, they invaded the nascent Soviet Union in the middle of the Civil War to try to strangle the Soviet Union.
Strangle it in the cradle.
In the cradle. And I mean, we're talking one little incident that's, just in the past few years been recognized by, British press, The Guardian and others. Churchill was a military commander of the British Expeditionary Force. He used chemical weapons on Russian towns. And that attack from outside helped solidify the support of the Russian people with the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and helped. There was a siege mentality. There was a paranoia that developed during the Soviet Union, but with good reason.
Perhaps I could answer your question. I mean, Bolshevism changed. The party changed. Its ideology.
Well, yeah, there were purges. There were purges. People disappeared.
The Bolshevism of 1917 is not the same as the Bolshevism that emerged from.
And is it because of the Civil War and because of the siege?
Obviously, this is the historical argument. Is the authoritarianism and totalitarianism of Bolshevism inherent in its ideology, its organisation, its personalities, or is it a result of historical circumstances? It's shaped by the. Now, my view is that it's shaped by the circumstances. But going back to your other question about violence and power, for the Bolsheviks, it was never just about violence and power for their own sake. It was about violence and power in the pursuit of utopia. And it's really important to understand, the radical utopian nature of the Bolshevik Revolution, of the Soviet project.
In retrospect, would you say that was a dangerous goal to have, utopia?
I think that's one of that is one of the negative. That is one of the lessons. I agree. Idealism is not practical politics.
Right.
Revolutions do devour their children. Yeah. So you have to be careful what you wish for. But that's not to say that the ideas themselves, the idealism, is anything inherently wrong with it. One of the interesting things about the Western coverage of the 100th anniversary, the predominant theme is actually, okay, yeah, there were all these negative consequences arising from the Russian Revolution, but actually the ideas of the revolution, yes, that inspired the revolution, remain relevant today. Particularly relevant today when so-called neoliberal capitalism is experiencing such a crisis, and there is a need to try and imagine alternatives, imagine different futures, to do some different things, yeah. And the Russian Revolution, and indeed the Soviet experience as a whole, has lessons to teach us, both negative and
that probably
positive.
Explains why Russians are very, very adverse to revolutions and dramatic political changes.
Let's talk about numbers of people today. Today in Russia, 56% of people regret the passing of the Soviet Union, but only 12% would like to see it restored as it was. Yeah. In Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, a recent poll by the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development says that over half, some 54% of people would like to see the return of a command economy.
Yes.
We've seen repeated polls in Romania and Hungary that say their lives were better off under the Soviet system. In the United States, millennials, a majority of them, some 51%, would prefer to live in a socialist or communist country. And this is YouGov, and of the total U.S. population, 34% would rather live in a socialist
Mark, you know what
country.
that reminds me of was when I was in graduate school at Berkeley, and I was going back and forth between communist Poland and Berkeley, and I told people in Poland that there are more communists in Berkeley than all of Poland here. Go ahead, really.
Well,
these millennials, I mean, they should have, if we could send them back in time, let them live in Albania in the 1960s, okay?
They don't know what they're talking about.
Well, I think that you asked a very important question. Was violence like innate in an ideology? Well, I would say that any utopia, any aggressive utopia, can spawn violence.
Look at Pol Pot.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was a utopian.
No, not only Pol Pot. The idea to have something like encouraging feminism in Afghanistan, that's an explosive idea which has been realized, or they tried to realize it for 20 years. The idea of radically changing Ukraine, making it an enemy of Russia, destroying all the communist past in Ukraine, that's a revolutionary
You're just saying
idea.
absolutism, having absolutes is an extremism. You need violence to make it, to get there.
In a way,
any change, any drastic political change.
We can agree that the Russian Revolution probably taught the West in the past more than it taught the Soviet Russia, so the West avoided a lot of our mistakes. But there are a few things that the Russians learned, and we have got immunized from these wrong ideas from the beginning. For example, let me give you an example. The idea that a writer could be made better or worse by his origin. In the Soviet Union, writers were divided into proletarian ones and bourgeois ones. So now when Russians hear about women's writing, gay writing, immediately we have a very skeptical attitude and we say, be a good writer who happens to be a woman. Be a good writer who happens to be gay.
Oh, God forbid the world could learn something from Russia, considering the environment here.
So there are certain bits of immunization that we got from this revolution, and one of them is that we're adverse to any kind of revolution now.
Rapidly running out of time here, Jeffrey, one of the things I think is very interesting is, during the Cold War, we had this captive nations concept in the West. A lot of people don't understand how much Russians suffered during the Revolution, during the Civil War, during the Second World War, and and one can make the argument that the entire breadth of the Soviet Union, its culture, and culture was attacked, and it was destroyed in many ways. I mean, I'm thinking of the Orthodox Church. Okay, a lot of people don't understand how much Russians survived because of the pursuit of utopia and an ideology.
Well, culture was destroyed, but an alternative was put in place. Yes, I mean there was.
We're still here.
Okay. There was a reconstruction of culture, of Soviet culture, which wasn't completely bad. I mean, which actually persists this day.
Nostalgia. I personally, I don't believe in utopias, and I don't think that communism is the answer to problems today. But I personally don't want to live in a world where we stop fighting to create a better world.
That's a really good point, Mark.
And I want just a quote here. Perhaps you'll recognize this communist thinker. People no longer obsess over the accumulation with things. We've eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy. That's the famous communist explorer and commander Jean-Luc Picard of the Starship Enterprise.
Okay. We need Starfleet and flag here. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Absolutely fascinating discussion. Watch the extended version of RT's YouTube channel. Many thanks to our guests here in Moscow, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, CrossTalk rules. Okay, now for the extended version of our program. Jeffrey, What have we missed so far in our discussion here? What is a seminal point that you want our viewers to understand about this 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution?
The point I want to understand is the radical nature of the Soviet project, yes? Radical utopian, idealistic nature. It wasn't just about an alternative to capitalism, a different socio-economic system. It was a project for the transformation of human nature. And, you know, the Bolsheviks and their communist successors kept coming back to their utopian goals, almost right the way through to the end. I mean, Gorbachev was nothing if not an idealist. Gorbachev saw another kind of utopian, transformation. So the driving force of ideas, idealism, utopianism, right away from the revolution through, right away to the end of, end of the Soviet project. That's the point I would like to get across.
Dima, how much is the Soviet experience the Russian experience? Because you have this ideology. What's grafted onto what? How did communist ideology become Russified? Okay, because you see the kind of because we did have despotism in Russia. You had a very hard rule with the Tsar. I mean, a long history of that here. A lot of people think that that's just kind of a red version of this kind of autocracy.
Sorry, Peter.
Go ahead.
It didn't actually get Russified. That's the whole point. I mean,
yes, I agree.
The predominant kind of concept in Soviet times was the concept of Soviet patriotism. Okay, that had a very strong Russian component, the whole idea.
Yeah, but the Tsarist period had the same exact thing.
Soviet patriotism was about citizenship, it was about loyalty to a certain set of values. It wasn't about ethno-nationalism, yes?
Absolutely.
That was and that's one of the reasons why, the Soviet multinational empire held itself together so long.
In the beginning,
so
there was actually a big attempt to push down what was called Great Russian Nationalism as a
Sure.
Well, and Stalin was a great cartographer also that divided and ruled over the minority groups, particularly goes all the way through Ukraine to the Caucasus. So that element is very much there.
Great Russian nationalism.
Nationalism is a big part of it.
Let me say that, of course, Lenin's Soviet Union was a lot more like a genuine leftist state, internationalist. Stalin's was a much more nationalist project, more Russified. But in general, Bolshevism or communism is not a Russian ideology, and it produced very similar results everywhere. I mean, I interviewed the Russian soldiers who were in Austria in 1945, and at the time, Austria was divided into sectors. There was the Soviet sector, there was the Western sector. The Soviet sector immediately looked like the Soviet Union after the Soviet army moved in, and it was not the Soviet officials, it was the local communists who basically made the shops empty, and life was pretty hard.
But Dima, at the same time, when I was in graduate school, it was almost kind of a joke. Is that the only country that really made the Soviet model work and work well was the East Germans, not because of the model, but because they were German. Okay,
absolutely,
that's my point. Okay,
but I think that we touched upon a very interesting and important thing that I think we did not develop in the first part of our discussion. Just like Mark, I'm absolutely against equalizing Nazism and communism. There is a great temptation to do it, and it started even before the World War II. The Social Democrats were the first to use the word totalitarian and equalizing, sort of equalizing Nazis and communists. But despite certain similarities on the surface, parades, songs, mass organizations, the results and the end aims, final aims of these two ideologies were profoundly different. And right now, what we see in Germany, not only in Germany, but in Europe in general, is a real rebirth, a real rehabilitation of any ideology that fought against Russia, that fought against the Soviet Union, not even against communism. And people forget that Hitler actually justified the creation of concentration camps by the need to fight Gulag. The German Nazis had the information about the Soviet concentration camps. They were scared, the German capitalists, if you want, they were scared to death. So they opted for Hitler as a deterrent against the communist Russian threat. And I'm afraid this story may repeat itself now again in Europe.
But hypotheticals, Jeff, is what are the chances that we wouldn't have seen this kind of virulent fascism in Europe in the 1920s if it hadn't been for the Russian Revolution, because you have the entire right, conservatives, focused on the Red Scourge.
I don't think you can blame fascism and Nazism on the
no,
Bolsheviks and Russian Revolution.
I don't think that's an appropriate word, blame, okay? A cause and effect, okay?
Yeah, but the main cause of fascism, Nazism, dictatorship, authoritism in interwar Europe was the world economic crisis of late 1920s. Exactly. And of course, what happens...
And the fear... No, but that's a fact, but the perception is also the fear of the Red Scare, the Red Menace. That, I mean, I don't buy into that as being true. That was the fake news of that time.
I think that's a secondary factor. You know, it's the more fundamental, you know, collapse of the economic systems and collapse of confidence in capitalism, and the political consequence of that. Of course, the other point to make is that what actually stops this authoritarianism and nationalism and so on taking a grip on Europe and perhaps the whole world, what happens is the Second World War happens, and it's the Soviet Union that actually defeats Nazi fascism and democracy. The Soviet Union actually saved the world for democracy.
It's really interesting, Mark, and no one would ever say it was communism that saved the West. You'd never hear that, would you? Would you, ever?
No, and I'm not so sure I would put it in those terms.
Well, that was the ideology of the state.
I think it's useful that if we separate, when we're looking, we look at the revolutionary period with Lenin, we look at Stalin's, the purges, the formation of the Gulag. And by the way, the first concentration camp, the first Gulag in Russia, was established by the British during the Expeditionary Forces invasion in 1918. They got their models from British use in Africa.
What do you bet most of our viewers have never even heard of that? Never heard of that.
Yeah, well, and the post-Stalin period, because that was vastly different. Sure. And that is the Soviet Union that most people today remember fondly, that have nostalgia for. It's the post-Stalin Soviet Union of Brezhnev that most Russian people feel
stagnation.
It was a time of economic stagnation, but it was also a time of contentment. It was a long period of economic stability,
after
free education,
decades.
Free health care after catastrophic
peace.
Decades. Yes, relative peace. Yeah.
When you jump in.
The conversation's moved on. Ask me a question.
I think I can jump in. I think that actually when we are talking about the birth of the Soviet Union, it was not just the early years of the Soviet power, it was also the 1940s, the post-war years, because the Baltics, Western Ukraine, all these territories that were outside the initial Soviet Union, they were integrated and with huge pain. You know, and this pain was hidden from the populace. Brezhnev and Khrushchev didn't want to tell the people that there were rebellions in Lithuania, in Western Ukraine. That was a taboo subject, or almost taboo, right? So a lot of Russians are still surprised. You know, they say, how come these regimes are so hostile to us? Well, I mean, Stalin's time was the time of the birth of the Soviet Union, which was very painful.
Again, you know, we keep talking about power, violence, and ideology. I mean, incorporating the Baltic republics, for example, redrawing the map of Ukraine. Was that for ideological reasons or for security reasons? And it seemed to me it was more security than ideology at the time.
I think the argument...
They didn't just annex the territories, did they?
I didn't say annex.
No, but if it's just been about security, about power, you can just annex them, take control, yeah? What they did was they actually incorporated them and actually carried through a kind of revolution in those territories. Yeah? I mean, a nasty, violent, brutal revolution. But that shows the utopian, ideologically driven nature of the regime. It's not just about power and realpolitik.
I think the jury will still be out for many years if it was for ideological reasons or security reasons. On the security side, it was a wise decision because the German army advancing on Leningrad was defeated, or rather made harmless, in Estonia. If they had started from Estonia, they would have taken Leningrad 100%. And that would be a huge tragedy because Leningrad had several million people, including communists, Jews, all of these people would be destroyed, right? So from the ideological point of view, it was a huge mistake by Stalin. It was noted even by George Kennan, you know, the US ambassador in the Soviet Union in 1945, because George Kennan traveled there. Yep. He saw the mood there. He said that these countries will ultimately poison the Soviet Union. Stalin forgot what role the minorities played in the revolutionary movement before 1917. So basically, getting rid of these territories in 1917 saved the Soviet Union, the future Soviet Union, from a lot of trouble. And now we're in the same situation. When people now say that Russia is weaker than the Soviet Union, I ask my question. The Soviet Union could not defeat the West in Afghanistan, the war that we didn't need, that cost us a lot. But Russia now has been successful in Syria. We have been visited not by parasites, I'm sorry, parasites from Ethiopia and Angola who came to us in the 1970s. We were visited by the Saudi king and the Turkish president, serious people. So in a way, Russia is now more successful than the Soviet Union. And those serious people don't come here because of ideology, Mark.
Yes, that's true. Power and ideology, right? We shouldn't really discuss the Soviet Union outside the context of capitalism, because it was birthed as a reaction to capitalism. It lived during a period of capitalism, and it was ended and ushered in by capitalism. Communism, such as it was, is a footnote in history, an interesting great experiment defined by capitalism. The New York Times, the Washington Post have all run headlines this week talking about the red century, the century of communism. It wasn't. The 20th century was the century of capitalism. Yeah. And I'm interested to see what generation of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, millennials in the US, what they'll make of the next century, what the next great experiment will be.
I'm not sure. I don't agree with that, Mark. I don't think it was just...
30 seconds, Jeff.
It wasn't a footnote, yeah? For a start off, the Russian Revolution, the Soviet experiment fundamentally changed the nature of Western capitalism by the challenge that it posed. You know, Western capitalism has never been and will never be the same as it was before the Russian Revolution and before the Soviet system. And its history. So I think in a way it's the opposite. In a way, you could say maybe the other things that were.
Okay, gentlemen,
Western capitalism.
I have to jump in here. We've run out of time, but our discussion here just proves just how contentious this issue is. And okay, no drinking on set here. Okay, we've run out of time, gentlemen. I'm being told we have to go. I hope you enjoyed the extended version of our program. And remember, crosstalk rules.
To history.
To history. We're gonna get